Hey guys, tonight we journey back, way, way back, to the land of dusty bricks, looming ziggurats, and sandals that slap softly against packed earth. You're standing barefoot in the courtyard of an ancient Babylonian home, the kind with whitewashed walls and a roof made of woven reeds. The air is dry, scented faintly with crushed herbs from the kitchen next door, and a thin rooster somewhere thinks he's important. You squint upward. The morning sun is creeping over the eastern wall, just enough to toss your shadow onto the smooth courtyard floor. And that, oddly enough, is the moment when your day begins. Not because of a chime or a buzz, but because your shadow says so. See, in ancient Babylon, time doesn't tick. It stretches. It stretches like shadow on stone, slanting lazily at dawn and growing stern by noon. Nobody wears a watch, but everyone watches, especially the priest scribes and merchant wives who could estimate the time just by how your elbow shadow landed on a scratch they etched into the courtyard pavement 15 years ago. Shadows, here, are sacred and practical, and sometimes both. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin your day just as many Babylonians did, rising with the light. Not because it's dramatic, but because there's no better option. The rooster isn't your alarm clock. The creeping sunlight is. Your home is oriented in such a way that the first wedge of gold spills directly onto a worn threshold stone, and that's how your family knows it's time to stir. There are no curtains. Why would there be? The sun is the system. Historians still debate whether sunrise rituals were as common in regular households as they were in temple life. But what's agreed on is this: light and time were intertwined like reeds in a basket. You couldn't separate your daily rhythm from the way sunlight flowed around you. Some wealthier households placed polished copper plates on the wall to catch the first glimmers, both to beautify the room and make sure no one overslept. Outside, the city is slowly waking. Babylon isn't quiet, but it's not hurried either. You hear the slap of clay jars being lowered into wells, the low groan of a sleepy ox cart, and the faint metallic clink of a temple bell being nudged into action. But most telling of all is what you see: the shadows, thin ones, slicing low along the mud brick alleys. They stretch out behind every merchant, child, and goat, announcing their presence like lazy heralds of the day. Your neighbor, old Akar, is already standing at his sundial stone. It's a simple contraption, a flat stone disc with notches carved into the edge and a peg, called a gnomon, stuck firmly in the middle. Akar isn't a scientist. He's a baker. But he swears his bread rises best when mixed at the shadow of the third notch. "Good shadow today," he grunts. You nod, as if you have any idea what that means. The use of such crude sundials wasn't just for scholars or astrologers. Even common people learned to read the subtle shifts in shadow throughout the day. Some just watched how far the light advanced across their courtyard. Others marked the passage of time by where the shade landed on their house cat. That cat was, perhaps, the earliest version of a solar-powered smartwatch, except fluffier and more judgmental. Not all sundials were simple, though. Within the temple precincts, especially near the ziggurat dedicated to Marduk, priests operated elaborate shadow-casting devices, some vertical, some horizontal. These early astronomers weren't just obsessed with daylight, they were practically dating it. They watched for solstices, equinoxes, and eclipses, recording shadow lengths on tablets that they stored in libraries bigger than some modern college campuses. You'd think that would be boring, and you'd be right, in the best way. It's said, though some scholars disagree, that young priest apprentices would sit in silence for hours, tracking the slow creep of shadow across a gridded stone. No chatting, no scribbling, just pure observational zen. They probably had the patience of a stone and the attention span of a snail. Perfect for sleep, right? And yet, this wasn't just ceremonial. These measurements helped anchor Babylon's complex lunisolar calendar. Since the day was divided into 12 parts of varying lengths depending on the season, understanding where the shadow fell was key to everything from scheduling temple offerings to calculating irrigation schedules. You hear a whisper across the courtyard. Your uncle is calling you to breakfast. It's time for a bowl of barley porridge, maybe with dates, if the harvest's been good. The smell drifts past your nose just as your own shadow climbs a finger width higher on the wall. It's not even mid-morning yet, but already you can feel how the city organizes itself around the sun. You eat slowly, watching the light shift, the same way someone today might watch the stock ticker crawl by. Later, you'll join others in the town square, where a larger public sundial stands. But for now, you rest your back against the warm wall and close your eyes. You can still sense time, soft and golden, rolling over your toes like warm water. By the time you shuffle into the temple district, the sun is higher, casting tighter shadows that make the whole city feel like it's standing at attention. The light now falls almost vertically, sharpening every brick's edge, turning each ziggurat stair into a blazing ramp. And in the middle of it all stands one of the most revered and overlooked tools of the ancient world, the giant gnomon. No, not a mystical beast or the name of a Babylonian rock band. A gnomon is the vertical stick that casts the all-important shadow in a sundial. This one's taller than a grown man and planted squarely in a raised stone circle carved with cryptic marks, gentle grooves, and chipped symbols that even some temple scribes pretend to understand. Standing nearby is a temple attendant, half asleep, trying to look alert while simultaneously holding a ceremonial stick and a kind of bronze timing cup. He might not be a priest yet, but he's what you'd call a human alarm clock. His job? Announce to the senior priests when the shadow crosses a certain notch. You'd think someone would have invented a bell or something, but no. You get a temple boy with sandals too big for his feet and a cough that he insists isn't from the incense. As the sun continues to rise, the gnomon's shadow shortens. This, in itself, is the big show. You watch silently as that long, dark wedge creeps inward toward the very center of the stone dial. This isn't entertainment in the way you'd think of it today. There are no fireworks, no dramatic music, but it's mesmerizing. The entire crowd quiets, focused on that slow movement. Historians still argue whether such public timekeeping displays had civic or strictly religious functions. Was it to remind everyone of their obligations to the gods, or just a convenient way to coordinate lunch? Likely both. But either way, the ceremony of watching the shadow shrink became part of the rhythm of daily life. The priests use this moment to decide the beginning of the second work segment of the day. Babylonian time, remember, doesn't move in precise hourly chunks. It flows with the sun, shifting with the seasons. Summer hours are longer than winter ones, which made keeping track tricky. Enter the gnomon, tall, silent, and never running out of batteries. You stretch your back and walk slowly around the base of the sundial, noticing the way some of the inscriptions have been worn down. One shows a lion with a paw raised. It's said that when the shadow touches that paw, the high priest begins his mid-morning chants. Another mark looks suspiciously like a chicken. You suspect someone added that later. Back then, there was no standard way to build a sundial. Some were tilted, some flat, others vertical. The size of the gnomon, the spacing of the hour lines, all depended on who made it, where it was placed, and how much math they were willing to endure. Let's be honest, probably not much, unless you were part of the priesthood or an astrology-obsessed scribe with a passion for base 60 calculations and absolutely no social life. The city itself relied heavily on these time readings. Farmers needed to know when to begin irrigation cycles. Merchants timed their stall openings around the shadows on temple steps. And yes, even public workers, like sweepers or animal handlers, would get called to duty when a particular shadow hit a mark on the city wall. There were, naturally, mishaps. One of the more fringe but delightful records suggests a shadow misread during a royal parade led to musicians playing the ceremonial drum march 3 hours too early. The result? A slightly confused king, a very startled camel, and one drummer reassigned to stable cleaning duty. You walk away from the temple sundial, and as you turn a corner, you spot another gnomon, shorter this time, barely waist-high, tucked into a smaller plaza. This one's used by local shopkeepers. They're not concerned with religious timing, just with things like, when will the bread get stale? And is it too early to charge double for dates? Their system is cruder, but it works. When the shadow touches the marked line on the wall, prices change. Simple economics, guided by celestial geometry. And yes, this means you could technically argue with a vendor over the sun if you caught them raising prices before the correct shadow mark. Imagine yelling, "Your gnomon lies," in a marketplace. That's peak Babylonian drama right there. You pause near a shaded alley where two children are playing a kind of hop game involving drawn lines and chasing shadows. It's not a school activity, but it may as well be. These kids are learning to read light the way some children today read clocks. Or, let's be honest, try to figure out AM from PM on microwave timers. A wandering scribe passes by, scratching notes into a clay tablet, likely recording the precise angle of today's shadow relative to the last full moon. You wonder if he finds it exciting or just routine. Probably both. Babylon wasn't built in a day, but it was scheduled down to the sunbeam. The temple bell finally rings again, gently, like someone flicked a bronze bowl with a reed. That means the next portion of the workday has begun. You feel it too, not in your bones, but in the way the light now angles sharply through narrow passageways, illuminating the street in gold and dust. Time has passed, but not in a hurry. Here, it glides. It stretches and contracts, always grounded in something ancient and shining and just a little bit sleepy. The air has warmed by now, and the city hums with life, but still gently, like a half-awake cat on a windowsill. You shuffle along a shaded arcade, listening to sandals scuff lazily over sun-baked clay. You're headed toward the school quarter, where children recite Sumerian by heart and scribes in training practice writing on clay tablets until their fingers ache. But you're not here for grammar. You're here for shadows. Again. Just ahead is a peculiar courtyard, a little oasis of geometry nestled between walls lined with ivy. You spot a cluster of sundials, but none like the temple's majestic gnomons. These are smaller, flatter, weirder. One looks like a sideways shoe, another like a turtle shell with pegs poking out. They're not broken, they're instructional. This is where Babylonian kids learned about time the fun way. You wander past a row of boys playing a game where they hop over each other's shadows. One chants something about the sixth notch curse, and when the shadow crosses a chalk line, they all burst into laughter and collapse into a pile. No one quite remembers how the rules work, but the timing? That they know by heart. Historians still debate whether these playful uses of shadow were pedagogical or just coincidental, but clay tablets have been uncovered showing diagrams of sundials used in children's education. Some included tiny riddles like, "What has no voice but tells the hour?" Answer, "Your shadow, unless the cat's sitting on the gnomon again." Your attention drifts to one of the strangest sundials on display, a curved plate with a notch at the center and carved lines radiating like sunbeams. A small stick, maybe the length of your hand, stands upright in the middle. It's not very accurate, off by a good half hour if you trust old Akar's opinion, but it's beautiful in its simplicity. You crouch beside it, running your fingers over the grooved lines. They're smooth from use, like a favorite spoon. You lie back on a sun-warmed bench, letting your own shadow spill off the edge, and recall a story about traveling merchants who used their walking staffs as makeshift sundials. They'd jam the stick in the ground at noon, watch the direction of the shadow, and figure out which way was home, or which way was least likely to involve being mugged by desert bandits. Even on the move, shadows were trustworthy companions. Better than your cousin Elam, who once got lost on the way to the barley fields and insisted the stars were just messing with him. There were also wearable sundials, if you can believe it, though not like wristwatches. Some wealthier officials are said to have carried small, portable dials shaped like sandals. The wearer would place the sandal on the ground and use the straps as guides to read the shadow's angle. You imagine the confusion this caused in a public square. Why is that man measuring the sun with his shoe? And yet, it kind of worked. Not flawlessly, after all, Babylonian hours changed length depending on the season, but well enough for most daily needs. Plus, it gave you something to do while pretending to wait for your late friend. One mainstream historical fact that often gets lost in translation is that Babylonian hours weren't fixed like ours. They divided daytime into 12 parts and nighttime into another 12, no matter how long the sun actually stayed up. That meant an hour in summer could be significantly longer than one in winter. Imagine trying to explain that to someone rushing to catch a chariot. And yes, the exact placement of gnomons mattered. A few inches this way or that, and you'd get an entirely different result. Shadow alignment was an art and a headache, which explains why professional shadow readers were sometimes hired to double-check sundials before official events. That's right, consultants existed even back then. You reach the edge of the school courtyard and notice a tiled bench, half shaded, half lit. Perfect place for a nap, you think. But before you do, you spot one last curiosity, a carved stone set into the wall showing 12 stick figures in a circle, each holding a line connected to a central sun symbol. One of the figures is upside down. The inscription below says something roughly equivalent to, "He who rushes the sun finds only his own shadow." You don't know what that means, but it's poetic enough to ponder later when you're pretending to pay attention to market negotiations. As you sit, a gentle breeze lifts the hem of your tunic. Dust swirls lazily near your feet. Shadows begin to shift again, stretching slightly, bending toward afternoon. You wonder if anyone ever got too obsessed with measuring time by shadow. You picture a man so fixated he names his children after sun angles. Come here, mid-noon and third notch. According to one fringe tale, of questionable historicity but delightful in tone, a Babylonian noble once refused to attend his own wedding because the shadow didn't feel right. The priest, the bride, and an entire goat feast waited 3 hours until the angle improved. They say he had a long and surprisingly punctual marriage afterward. And so you rest there, watching light shift across stone, dials whispering the day forward without urgency or noise. There's something soothing about time that doesn't tick, that doesn't shout at you to go faster. It just leans quietly forward and lets the day unfurl. The sun is nearly overhead now, and Babylon is at its brightest. Walls gleaming pale gold, narrow alleys cast into sharp relief, and the ziggurat glowing like a sunlit mountain. You step into a shaded arcade to escape the heat, brushing past merchants fanning themselves with palm fronds. Somewhere nearby, someone is complaining about a late delivery of figs. Time matters here, but not like it does in our world. You make your way toward the astronomer's observatory, a place where timekeeping isn't just about planning lunch or dodging temple chores. It's practically divine. Because in Babylon, watching shadows and tracking stars were two sides of the same dusty coin. You push aside a woven curtain and enter a long, dim corridor lined with stone shelves. Clay tablets are stacked everywhere, each etched with scribbles that would give your modern math teacher a migraine. These are the records of celestial movement, solar paths, and, yes, shadow angles. And the head scribe? He's perched at the end of the room with a crooked reed stylus and a weary look that says, "I've measured the sun so long I can see it when I close my eyes." You join him outside, where a raised platform hosts the main device. Not a telescope, but a flat stone dial, carefully etched and precisely aligned to the cardinal directions. At the center is another gnomon, but this one is short and stubby, like it's been through a few too many dusty seasons. The scribe explains, in a voice as soft as parchment, that this is the shadow star chart. It tracks not just the time of day, but how shadow angles vary by season. That variation, it's what helped Babylonian astronomers synchronize their solar and lunar calendars. It's not science as we know it. It's geometry spiced with mysticism. You tilt your head, watching the stubby gnomon cast its shadow across the dials. The scribe murmurs something about 15 fingers long, and you pretend to understand. Apparently, today's shadow is one notch ahead of where it was this time last month. An important omen if you're a royal advisor or someone trying to predict barley yields. Historians still argue whether these complex measurements were fully understood by the people recording them, or if they were partially ritualized guesswork. The line between math and magic was a wiggly one in Babylon, but the records don't lie. These folks were obsessive. They logged shadow lengths on the solstices, cataloged when certain stars rose at dawn, and created tables that could rival any spreadsheet today, assuming you don't mind your spreadsheet being made of baked mud. You learn something oddly delightful here. Babylonian astronomers used a concept called Zikpu stars, which helped mark the months by tracking which stars were visible just before sunrise. That means they had to measure night shadows too, not just day. And they hacked sundial logic by using moonlight and starlight as substitutes. Yes, they made nocturnal shadow charts. You try not to laugh, but it's charming, like someone using a flashlight and a cardboard cutout to test their horoscope. But it worked, or at least worked well enough to keep the temple calendar on track, avoid festival mix-ups, and convince everyone that the gods weren't annoyed. There's even a quiet rivalry among the scholars. Some prefer lunar tracking, others solar. One old tale says two scribes refused to speak for years because one accused the other of shadow inflation, whatever that meant. To this day, historians are still trying to decode whether that was an actual disagreement or just ancient sass. As you leave the observatory, the heat hits you like a sleepy pillow. You wander past a fountain, watching as a few priests toss date pits and argue over whether the sun will reach the ziggurat's third stair before or after the incense offering. You check the angle of a pillar's shadow, and, look at you, you've started doing it too. Even for those not involved in science or religion, timekeeping by shadow became personal. Farmers kept sunstones on the edge of their fields, not just to know when to water, but also when to pray. Builders checked shadow lengths to make sure walls aligned properly, because nothing ruins a public bath like the sun glaring directly into your eyes at noon. There's even a superstition whispered among bricklayers. If your building's shadow falls on a neighbor's goat pen at dawn, your roof will leak within a month. Is it true? Probably not. But do they still argue about it over dinner? Absolutely. Another quirky footnote in Babylonian sundial lore is the whispering hour, a short sliver of time just before sunset, when shadows stretch long and golden. Some believed it was when spirits roamed, or at least when it was best to recite poetry. That may be why so many love poems were timed to start just as a lover's shadow touched the water basin. Romantic and punctual, the sky begins to pale just slightly. You can feel the turning. It's not dramatic, not loud, but in the way the light no longer bites, it glows. Shadows lengthen. Time loosens its belt a little. You close your eyes for a moment and hear the scribes inside, scratching away at their clay, calculating celestial angles with sleepy precision. Even the stars are getting restless, waiting behind the curtain of dusk for their cue. The sun lowers its gaze, and the shadows, loyal as ever, follow in step. Your sandals crunch gently along a side street now, where the shadows fall longer, and the midday chatter has settled into a kind of slow, communal yawn. The sun is sliding past its apex, and Babylon begins to shift, just a little, as if the entire city is exhaling after a long morning of measurements, murmured prayers, and time told in angles. You pass a wide courtyard lined with benches, some in sun, some in shade. At the center, a raised platform holds a sundial that's more ornate than most. It's been polished smooth from centuries of use, the stone glowing faintly in the golden light. But it's not the sundial that draws your attention. It's the priest beside it, adjusting something with great care. This is the Temple of Marduk, the grandest in the city, and here, timekeeping is not just a civic matter, it's divine choreography. The priests don't just measure time, they orchestrate it. At this very moment, one is shifting the gnomon ever so slightly to align with the day's specific solar declination. If that sounds fancy, that's because it is. It's also wildly imprecise by modern standards. But here, it's holy. The sun glints off the gold-threaded hem of the priest's robe as he backs away and claps softly. The movement signals several other attendants who bring out thin wooden rods, measuring sticks, marked with black lines and faint numbers in cuneiform. These are tools, but also props in a solar performance that has been repeated for centuries. And here's the thing. While this may look ceremonial, it works. More or less. The Temple of Marduk has been using shadow positions to time offerings, chants, festivals, even royal declarations. When the shadow hits the edge of a carved eagle's wing, incense is lit. When it kisses the corner of the lion's tail, the music begins. When it passes over the center line, it's time for a royal edict, or occasionally, a lunch break. Historians still debate whether these alignments were meticulously planned architectural feats or the result of years of patient adjustments. Some argue the entire temple was built to track solar positions like a giant sacred clock. Others suggest the alignments were accidental. The kind of accidental that becomes tradition once everyone agrees to act impressed. You walk around the platform, tracing your fingers along grooves carved into the floor, channels where water once flowed during ritual cleansings. One of these grooves intersects a marked spot on the sundial's base. That spot? Supposedly the heart of noon, a poetic term used to describe the exact moment when the sun stood still. Not literally, of course. Babylonians weren't heliocentric. But symbolically, it was believed that time held its breath there, just for a flicker. This concept of sacred stillness is oddly comforting. Imagine a world where every day has a moment, brief and silent, when all things pause together. The sun, the shadows, the people, the goats. Everyone takes a beat. You glance up at the tall temple wall. A painted fresco depicts the god Marduk holding a rod and a ring, symbols of measurement and order. It's fitting. In Babylon, divine authority wasn't just about smiting enemies or turning rivers into blood. It was about keeping the cosmos aligned, the festivals timely, and the shadows in check. Nearby, a group of temple apprentices huddles around a clay tablet, arguing softly over a calculation. One of them is using a piece of string and a small bronze peg to demonstrate how the shadow should have fallen on the winter solstice 3 years ago. They speak in half whispers, the way people do when they're reverent and also slightly terrified they might get the math wrong. You overhear a snippet. But if the angle was 10 fingers at the lion's mane, then the barley was late that year. You don't understand it fully, but you appreciate the logic. To them, time and nature and divine favor are braided together like a triple strand rope. One phrase, the others follow. This wasn't just a priestly quirk. The king himself relied on these measurements. It's said that during certain years, royal decrees were delayed or advanced based on solar anomalies, cloud cover, misaligned shadows, eclipses. There's even a recorded instance where the shadow landed between omens, and the royal astrologers argued for 7 days over what it meant. Eventually, the king decided it meant it was time to throw a festival. Can't go wrong with that. Of course, there were skeptics. One satirical tablet found near Sippar describes a priest so obsessed with shadow angles that he missed his own wedding, claiming the sun had refused to grant favor. His bride apparently married the assistant priest, whose only flaw was an irritating cough and a slightly crooked sundial. You pass under an archway into a side garden, walled off, quiet, humming with bees. At its center stands a smaller sundial, this one low and built from dark stone. A bird pecks around its base. This, according to local gossip, is the practice dial, used by apprentice priests who were still learning how to read shadow drift without mistaking it for a bird's tail or a loose reed. One fringe tidbit suggests these smaller dials were once enchanted with tiny bells that rang when the shadow reached certain lines. This is almost certainly poetic invention, but you have to admit, the idea of a chime marking a sacred minute is oddly lovely, like time singing to itself. As the sun rolls gently westward, you notice how the shadows in this garden stretch with more intent now. They're no longer shy, no longer tightly curled. They reach like fingers over stone, whispering their slow truths to anyone patient enough to watch. You sit, you breathe. You watch the light move and think, maybe time isn't something you chase. Maybe it's something you watch, something you listen to. And today, in the Temple of Marduk, it's whispering in shadows. The streets feel quieter now, even though the marketplace still hums faintly in the distance. You've wandered back into a residential quarter, narrow alleys, shady courtyards, and the occasional child peeking through a lattice. The sun is beginning its descent, shadows slanting eastward with a kind of sleepy confidence. It's the golden hour, Babylon style, and you're about to witness how measuring shadows has less to do with temples and more to do with taxes. Yes, taxes, because even in ancient Mesopotamia, someone had to count the cows. You arrive at a modest administrative house just off a main road. The courtyard is swept clean, with low benches, baskets of scrolls, and a clay jug that's probably been used as both water storage and stress ball. Inside, scribes are hunched over their tablets. Not the glowing kind, mind you, but slabs of wet clay, etched with rows of wedge-shaped script that crunch softly under the stylus. You greet the head clerk, a portly man named Bel-Adu, who doesn't look up as he mutters something about shadow discrepancies. On the wall behind him is a gnomon, not decorative, not ornate, just a stick jammed into a slot on a flat stone. Next to it are lines labeled with what look like grain symbols. Turns out, this isn't just an improvised sundial, it's a barley clock, barley. See, Babylon's administrative world depended on timekeeping. Tax collection, contract fulfillment, and market oversight were all pegged, sometimes literally, to specific solar moments. A farmer might be ordered to deliver a cart of wheat by the 7th shadow line after sunrise. which sounds poetic, until you realize it's also how you avoid a penalty fine. Historians still argue whether these time labels were standardized across the empire or varied wildly by region, but evidence suggests most cities had at least one official dial used to settle disputes. It was like having a municipal clock tower, except it needed sunshine and occasional de-weeding. One clay tablet, cracked and dusty, outlines a schedule for livestock tithes. When the sun crosses the mark of the bull's hoof, deliver 3 goats or 1 sheep with excellent fleece. The clerk shows it to you with the same reverence a modern accountant might show a particularly satisfying spreadsheet. You follow him to the rear garden, where yet another sundial sits, this one set on a brick pedestal surrounded by tiny ceramic markers. The clerk explains that during certain parts of the year, the barley tax was due precisely when the shadow aligned with a triangle marked Ninlil's mercy. That's right. Babylonian tax policy sometimes invoked goddesses of compassion. Cute, but still due by sundown. You imagine the farmers lining up, baskets of produce balanced on their heads, sweating not just from the heat, but from the anxiety of watching the shadow creep closer to the deadline. There's even a rumor, likely apocryphal but delightfully persistent, that a group of villagers once tried to stall a shadow's progress by waving palm leaves at the sun, hoping to delay time itself. The clerk rolls his eyes and says, "They paid double the next season." In one corner of the courtyard sits a crooked plank and a thin string weighted with a bead, an improvised shadow calibrator, or what today we might call the poor man's sundial. These tools weren't official, but they helped. When a string shadow fell across a certain scratch on a bench, it was time for the mid-afternoon shift in the office. Or maybe just snack time. Hard to tell. There's a quirky story passed down by scribes here about a misaligned sundial that caused absolute chaos in the spice market. The dial had been nudged, accidentally or by mischief, no one's sure. And as a result, vendors started packing up a full hour early. One particularly outraged fig merchant apparently threatened to sue the sun. The judge ruled it was the shadow's fault. Justice served, Babylon style. You sit near a small water basin and notice how the shadow of a nearby vine trellis stretches across the flagstones. For all the official systems and clerical exactitude, it's really the people who keep time moving. The clerk returns with a clay cup of lukewarm beer and offers it like a peace treaty. You take a sip. It tastes like barley, history, and maybe a little clay. The administrative quarter's relationship with time is different from the priest's, less sacred, more contractual. Time here isn't divine, it's currency. It's deliverables. It's a way to make sure someone shows up with your shipment of lentils before your wife starts complaining again. And yes, even trade caravans were scheduled by shadow. Inscriptions on trade ledgers include lines like, "Departed Ur at the 6th line after sunrise, expected in Sippar at dusk, shadow length permitting." Imagine using solar angles as your FedEx tracking system. Honestly, it might be more accurate. As the sun dips just a little more, you hear a soft clanging bell from the city center. That means the third work segment is ending. For scribes, this means tidying up, filing tablets, and possibly arguing over shadow calibration for the 6th time today. You stretch and gaze westward. The shadows now are longer, lazier, more dramatic. You watch as one spills over a measuring stone like syrup on warm bread. It's beautiful in a bureaucratic kind of way. And somewhere, in a dusty ledger, a clerk scratches the time into wet clay. Shadow reached mark at lion's elbow. Task completed. Beer break initiated. Time in Babylon, it seems, is always moving, sometimes in steps, sometimes in spills, but always guided by the quiet logic of light and stone. The light's taken on a softer quality now, mellow and golden, and you follow it as it slants down narrow alleys and spills over the lintels of homes. You're heading toward a quieter neighborhood now, where priests and scribes give way to laborers and artisans, people who still measure time, but with a touch less ceremony and a bit more practicality. You arrive at the modest home of a civil scribe named Nabushuma. His front courtyard smells faintly of reed parchment and yesterday's lentils. He isn't famous. He doesn't advise kings or divine omens. But he does know when his ink needs drying, and that, in Babylon, is a perfectly respectable talent. You knock. A goat bleats in response. Eventually, Nabushuma appears, squinting against the light, brushing bits of tablet dust from his robe. He gestures you in without a word and points to the central courtyard where his personal sundial waits. It's a small setup, a tilted wooden plank with lines drawn in soot and a short peg stuck in at a deliberate angle. It looks like something a high schooler would make in science class and forget to turn in. But to Nabushuma, it's everything. I know when to stop writing, he says with a proud smile, because the shadow says so. This sundial isn't for divine rituals or taxation. It's to mark the ink rest, a slice of the afternoon when Babylonian scribes would pause their work to let their documents dry, stretch their legs, and possibly have a small snack. Fig paste, if you're lucky. Time management. Babylon style. Historians still discuss whether private sundials like these were common or a luxury of the literate class. But there's no doubt that among scribes, craftsmen, and household managers, shadow watching became a habit as natural as breathing. In a world without clocks, you don't just notice time, you negotiate with it. You settle into a worn bench while Nabushuma demonstrates. He crouches beside the plank, eyeing the shadow like a jeweler appraising a gem. It's just touching the third mark, he mutters. Time to stop writing complaints. You raise an eyebrow. He chuckles. About the barley shipments. They're always late. Must be cursed. He straightens up and gestures to a shelf full of clay tablets. I write what they say. Then I write what they meant to say. And then I drink. Nabushuma's sundial has a charm that the grander, more official ones lack. There are doodles scratched in the margins. One spot is labeled Shade Snack, and another simply says Nap, with a faint smudge where his forehead likely made contact. You walk around the little yard and notice something surprising. There are multiple sundials, each facing a slightly different angle. Nabushuma apparently has been experimenting. One has a string hanging from a fig branch, casting a wobbly shadow on a series of pottery shards. Another uses a polished copper bowl to reflect light onto a corner wall where time is marked by painted dots. He calls it his light bouncer. It's not official, he says, but it's fun. This fusion of shadow and creativity isn't uncommon. Babylonian timekeeping wasn't locked into strict tools. People adapted, improvised, invented. Sundials were scratched into roof tiles, carved into well rims, even etched onto doorposts. One merchant's wife famously kept time using the shadow of a fig tree that grew at just the right angle near her kitchen door. There's a story Nabu Shuma likes to tell, one of those fringe oral tales that may or may not be true, about a scribe who taught his parrot to squawk at a particular shadow length. The bird was trained to announce "end of scroll" when the ink had dried. No one could read the parrot's handwriting, but still, it was a solid assistant. As Nabushuma settles in for his ink rest, you take another look at his main sundial. There's something calming about it. Its lines aren't perfect, the peg is a bit wobbly, and it's clearly been repaired several times. But it's real, personal. It tells the time not in rigid hours but in rhythms. Start writing, take a break, finish before dinner, maybe throw a stick at the goat. You look up. The sun's edge is just beginning to dip below the eastern wall. The shadow now stretches long, grazing the wrap-up zone, which, according to a scribbled note, means it's nearly time to cover the clay and send the apprentice to fetch beer. Nabushuma stretches, cracks his knuckles, and sighs the sigh of a man who's done exactly enough today. "Shadows never lie," he says, standing. Then, a pause. "Unless you move the peg." You leave him there, grinning in his sleepy courtyard, surrounded by parchment smells and murmuring pigeons, his world gently ticking by in angles and afternoon amber. And as you step into the lane again, your own shadow leads the way, inching forward with the confidence of someone who always knows the time, even when no one else is paying attention. The light continues to slant. What was once crisp and vertical now spills wide across the streets of Babylon, pooling in doorways and stretching across rooftops. You walk slowly now, not from fatigue, but because the air itself seems to be slowing with you, thickening with gold. You're heading toward the edge of the artisan quarter, where modest homes and workshops cluster in the lee of the ziggurat's great shadow. And today, that shadow is missing. Not gone entirely, but thinner. Strange. You pause in a dusty square, eyes narrowing. The sundial here, flat and set into the flagstones, is barely casting a line. Its gnomon, a stubby bronze post shaped like a fig leaf, flickers faintly under the uncertain light. The sky is not overcast. Not exactly. It's dusty. A pale yellow film drapes across the heavens, filtering the sun's light and muting everything it touches. Not enough to cause alarm, just enough to confuse a scribe or two, or 12. And indeed, across the square, a priest stands with his hands on his hips, glaring at the sky as though it owes him an apology. A child, crouched near the sundial, pokes at the vague blur of its shadow and whispers, "Is it broken?" "No, little one." But Babylon's most dependable timekeeper, the sun, is having a moment. This wasn't rare in ancient times. Dust storms, eclipses, heavy clouds, each one could disrupt the delicate game of chasing shadows. And when that happened, people got nervous. Historians still argue about just how deeply such moments affected daily life. Did temple rituals pause? Were market deals postponed? Did officials hesitate to sign documents when the hour-marking shadow failed to appear? There's no definitive answer. But we know one thing. Babylon had no backup clocks. In these moments, everything slowed. Everything hesitated. You walk past a row of homes, noticing their sun markers, charcoal lines on stone thresholds, bits of colored glaze set into walls, all dull today, all waiting. In one window, an elderly woman leans out and squints upward. "It's too early," she mutters. Then, after a moment, "Or too late." It's unclear which bothers her more. There's a story, preserved in fragmentary cuneiform, about a day when a solar eclipse coincided with the barley tax deadline. Chaos ensued. The shadow never hit the goat line, the clerks refused to collect the payments, and one very confused herdsman tried to offer 2 ducks instead, just to be safe. The solution? Postpone the entire affair by 1 day and declare it a divine hiccup. The priests later wrote it down as an omen of balance restored. You reach a small shrine, tucked into a corner between 2 houses. It's unassuming, just a stone platform with a worn statue of Shamash, the sun god, seated on a throne with rays carved like gentle flames. At his feet is a tiny gnomon, just a peg really, set into a cracked sundial. And the shadow? It's not there. Or rather, it's there, but vague. A smear. A soft suggestion of time. You crouch, trace it with your finger. It doesn't fall on any particular hour line. It hovers in between, ambiguous, unresolved. You can almost hear Babylon holding its breath. In these moments, superstition tended to creep in. Some believed that when the shadow disappeared, the gods were asleep or displeased. Others claimed it meant the veil between day and night had thinned, and one should whisper rather than speak aloud. Children were told to walk only in groups. Scribes were instructed to recopy important records, just in case the ink had absorbed confusion along with the light. There's a fringe tale that a shadowless day once triggered a full-day city fast. Not for mourning, not for repentance, but because the stomach cannot tell time when the sun forgets. You pass 2 women crouched beside a broken jar, its spilled contents, lentils maybe, scattered on the ground. They're not cleaning them up. They're waiting, watching the ground, hoping the shadow of the nearby wall will fall farther before deciding whether to collect or discard the food. The wrong timing, after all, might offend the household gods. The sun shifts slightly behind the haze, and for a moment, the light returns, clearer now. A crisp line jumps to life on the little shrine's gnomon. It lands across the 5th mark, sharp and sure. You hear a collective sigh, not spoken, but felt, as if the city's lungs had deflated all at once. Time has resumed. In a nearby alley, a group of scribes begins packing up their tablets. One mutters, "No more omens today, the sun's made up its mind." And just like that, Babylon is back on track. Goats will be counted, bread will be sold. One woman begins sweeping lentils with new resolve. You smile, stepping out into the clear light. You glance behind you, noting the position of your own shadow. It's there, long and low but strong now. The city didn't panic. Not really. It just paused. Because when shadows disappear, Babylon waits. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Time here isn't owned. It's witnessed. And now, with the haze lifting and the day gently tilting into late afternoon, the watchers of time return to their posts, Sundial tenders, scribes, and even the goat-counting clerk with a stick shaped like a crescent moon. Time flows again, and you flow with it. The light is fading, slow and syrupy, and you feel it everywhere, in the way the breeze has cooled just slightly, in the laughter drifting lazily from a rooftop gathering, and most of all, in the lengthening shadows, those quiet, dutiful lines stretching out like sleepy cats across every threshold, bench, and garden wall. You make your way into a wide-open plaza, paved in stone and edged with squat buildings. This is the public square. Not for priests or nobles, but for people like you. Bakers, masons, traders with tired feet, a handful of dogs. At its center stands a sundial on a raised dais. Not the grand kind of Marduk's temple. No gold, no incense, no choir of priestly assistants. This one's made of brick and set into a circular foundation with a tall iron spike at its center. Around it, 12 heavy stones, unevenly spaced, clearly worn, but somehow confident. This is the people's dial. Children run past it without a second thought. An old man leans against its base, scratching his beard and muttering about the price of onions. But others pause. They glance at the shadow, make a tiny mental note, and continue on. It's not an event. It's a habit. Here, in the square, the sundial is like an old friend. Reliable, familiar, a bit grumpy when it rains. You take a seat near the edge and watch the way the iron spike's shadow creeps over to the 8th stone. According to local rhythm, that means it's time to finish up in the market. Bread stands close. Chickpea sellers start packing. Someone begins yelling about discount figs. Historians still argue whether public dials like this were coordinated across cities or invented ad hoc. Some believe this exact layout, 12 rough stones, iron gnomon, was passed down from older Sumerian prototypes. Others argue it was the result of convenience and collective memory. After all, once a community agrees on fig time, they don't tend to mess with it. What's certain is this: it worked. Not just for shopping. Meetings happened here. Marriages were arranged. Debts repaid, though rarely on the first reminder. One tablet even records that a local elder once resolved a family dispute by waiting until the shadow reached the 9th stone. He claimed, "That's when the air is most honest." You're not sure what that means, but it sounds wise. You wander toward a group of storytellers huddled beneath a cloth canopy. One is holding a carved wooden stick and tracing it in the dust. He's drawing a rough version of the square's sundial and explaining to the children how it works. When the shadow points here, he says, tapping one side, the market opens. When it reaches here, the bread goes stale. And when it touches this stone, he pauses dramatically, that's when your mother starts calling you home. The kids giggle. One tries to measure his own arm like a shadow. It doesn't go well. There's a warmth in this kind of timekeeping. Not scientific, not sacred, just shared. Time as something you feel with others. Something you nod to in the square before buying pickled garlic. You find yourself drifting toward a stall at the edge where an elderly woman sits with a basket of cloth and a sundial necklace. Yes, a necklace. It's small, made of bronze, with a foldable gnomon you can raise or lower. She smiles as you point. Still works, she says proudly. When I was young, we used it to time when the shade would hit our goat pen, and when my husband's excuses ran out. It's a reminder that time in Babylon wasn't just top-down from temples or scholars. It trickled through everyone's day in 100 small, ordinary ways. A shadow on a scarf, a line on a wall, a pebble set in the dirt at just the right angle. There's even a fringe legend among street vendors that if you set your stall up exactly one handspan before the 8th stone shadow hits, you'll have twice the customers. No one can prove it, but everyone tries. And as you rest against a sun-warmed stone, you start to feel the ease of it. The public square hums at its own speed. The sundial casts its gentle truth, and nobody rushes. Except the fig vendor. He's always in a hurry, even when the shadow says not to be. A breeze picks up. Cloth canopies flap. The iron spike's shadow begins its journey toward the 9th stone. You hear a woman whisper to her friend, "Almost home time." No bells, no alarms, just a line of darkness across stone. That's all it takes. Evening inches closer now. You can feel it not in the cold, because the heat still lingers in the stones, but in the angle of the light, in the way shadows now stretch not just long, but languid, like tired dancers bowing slowly off stage. You follow one of those shadows west, its soft edges brushing along a low wall where vines have begun to curl in on themselves for the night. You're heading toward the outer edges of the city, where farms begin to spill into the distance, and the sun's descent is watched with a particular kind of focus. Here, in the neighborhoods beyond the ziggurat's proud silhouette, people don't just read shadows, they adapt to them. At a fork in the road, a weathered stone marker stands etched with strange curves. You squint. It's a kind of timekeeping diagram, but oddly curved. Arcs instead of straight lines. It's part of a seasonal sundial, one designed to account for the shifting path of the sun through the year. Yes, the Babylonians, in all their dusty brilliance, were among the first to wrestle with a very real challenge. Time behaves differently depending on the season. And unlike your modern phone clock, which rudely insists that every hour is the same length, theirs respected the truth. Hours in Babylon expanded and contracted with the sun. That means a summer hour could last what we'd call 75 minutes. A winter one, barely 45. Historians still argue about how precisely Babylonians corrected for this. Some believe they simply accepted the irregularity and adjusted behavior. Others suggest they used multiple sundials, each calibrated to a particular month or solstice. There's even evidence of slanted dials with curved hour lines, designed to mimic the sun's seasonal arc. You pause beside a sun-baked stone bench and imagine being a farmer watching the length of your day change, not just by the light, but by how your goats behave. "They always nap at second long shadow," you hear one herder say, "even when the gods forget." You smile. Animals often make better clocks than people. Out in the fields, time was read differently. Shadows didn't fall on stone. They landed on furrows, on irrigation canals, on the edge of a threshing mat. Farmers marked their day not by numbered hours, but by practical thresholds. Plow until your shadow touches the tree. Rest when the ox's ears are golden in the light. Home before the hills cast their veil. You pass a field boundary where 3 stones stand in a line, each one a different shape. A boy nearby sees you looking and says proudly, "They're the day's teeth, morning, noon, and done." He points to the nearest one, already touched by shadow. We're at the last tooth now. The metaphor makes perfect sense. Each stone bites off a piece of sunlight, measuring not in digits, but in moments. And that's where Babylon's early version of time zones comes in. Not the mapped, standardized swaths of modern convenience, but an instinctive local awareness that late afternoon means something different in the fields than it does behind temple walls. Within the city, noon is when the temple bell echoes. But out here, it's when the birds stop singing and the dogs begin sniffing for leftovers. Evening isn't a number, it's a rhythm. You find yourself on a rise, overlooking the bend of the river Euphrates, silvering now in the low light. Villagers gather by the bank to wash, to collect water, or simply to watch the sky shift colors like melting copper. Nearby, an elder squints at the horizon, then nods. 3 fingers left, he says. You look. He's holding his hand out, counting the finger widths between the sun and the horizon. A classic Babylonian trick. Each finger represents roughly 15 minutes. If your hand's steady and the sun's not playing tricks, you'll know when it's time to start dinner, or run home before the oil lamps go out. It's a method that works regardless of class, education, or temple affiliation. All you need is your hand and a decent angle, and maybe good posture. It's said that traveling merchants learned to do this trick while riding, measuring time by balancing baskets and squinting past donkey ears. Some even painted lines on their arms to help with speed estimates. One particularly creative courier painted his donkey with shadow lines. The animal didn't seem to mind, probably appreciated the attention. As the sun dips lower still, the city seems to hold its breath again, but not in fear, in reverence. Shadows stretch to their limits now, climbing walls, touching rooftops, brushing across sandals and straw mats. There's a brief, glowing stillness when everything feels suspended. Not quite day, not quite night. The curved sundials, the etched stones, the finger widths, they all agree. The day is ending. And so, in this softly slanting light, Babylon performs one of its oldest, quietest rituals. It lets the sun go. The sun is melting into the western horizon now, slow as syrup, wide as a yawn. You can feel the shift deep in your bones, coolness rising up from the stones underfoot, the way lanterns are being lit not because it's dark yet, but because everyone agrees it's nearly time. And in Babylon, that's enough. You make your way toward a neighborhood square where an unusual crowd is gathering. Priests, scribes, merchants, even the guy who always smells faintly of onions. They're not waiting for a speech. They're watching the lion. More specifically, a lion statue, carved from basalt, seated atop a low platform. And next to that lion's massive paw is a notch in the stone. Subtle, weathered, but unmistakable. When the shadow of the nearby obelisk touches that paw, it's time to settle disputes. This isn't myth. This is court time. Yes, Babylon had scheduled justice, and the shadow was the judge's assistant. You slip into the crowd just as the final rays begin to stretch long across the square. The obelisk's silhouette creeps forward until, there it is. The edge brushes the lion's paw. A few murmurs ripple through the square. Someone nudges their cousin. A scribe leans down and presses a clay seal into the dust to mark the hour. Court is now in session. Historians still puzzle over how rigidly this shadow time was enforced. Did every case begin the second the shadow touched stone? Was there a grace period? Did judges squint anxiously on cloudy days, whispering, "Just call it the paw already"? We may never know. But what we do know is that shadow-based justice was taken seriously. The timing of hearings, the reading of proclamations, even the start of penalties, they were all choreographed with the sun. One of the reasons, scholars suspect, was practical. No one wanted trials running into darkness, especially without reliable lighting. But there was also a spiritual component. Shadows were seen as honest, silent, neutral, shaped only by the sun. To begin a trial under the wrong shadow, that might unbalance the outcome, or worse, offend the gods. You shuffle closer to listen. A man is accused of overcharging for sesame oil. He protests, loudly. The judge listens, rubs his beard, and then glances at the shadow, still touching the paw, still time. He gestures to a youth holding a clay scroll. The boy reads aloud a list of agreed-upon sesame prices from the last harvest. A second boy, maybe his cousin, holds a short rod and uses it to measure the defendant's flask. Too small. The crowd hisses like sand on hot brick. Verdict: refund and apology. The defendant bows with a frown. The judge nods. The shadow holds steady. You look around. Nobody is surprised. Justice isn't hurried here. It arrives with the sun, leaves with it too. And as the shadow drifts farther, slipping off the lion's paw and onto the base of a fig tree, the judge raises a hand. "Time," he says. That's it. The court is over. No final gavel, no dramatic music, just a nod to the sky and the slow shuffle of feet. There's something oddly comforting in this. Time isn't abstract here. It's embodied. You can see it, follow it, wait for it. And when it comes, you accept what it brings. There's an old joke among Babylonian scribes that you never lie before the lion. Maybe because the paw is too honest. Or maybe because time itself is watching. You wander to the edge of the square, where two older men are debating something in hushed tones. "The shadow was early," one insists. "No," says the other. "You were late." They both nod sagely, as if they've each made an excellent point. You get the feeling that's how most arguments end around here. Another tale, less respected by historians, but more loved by children, tells of a lizard who nested beneath the lion and caused several misreadings of court time one summer. The solution? Relocate the lizard and build a second shadow marker just in case. Safety in redundancy. You glance one last time at the lion's paw. The shadow is gone now, curled up somewhere further east, marking the passage of time in a different neighborhood. Maybe even over someone's dinner plate. You follow it quietly, past doors just beginning to close, past a boy lighting oil lamps with a stick that glows at the tip. Shadows no longer stretch, they drape. But somewhere, in the back of your mind, you hear the words, "When the shadow hits the paw, truth begins." And you wonder, what other things in life might feel more fair, more centered, if they started only when the light was just right. The evening has officially arrived, not because a clock struck, not because a bell tolled, but because the light has changed into something you feel more than see. It's in the hush that rolls through the alleys, the way shopkeepers tug gently on woven door covers, and in the long, soft exhale of the day itself. You walk slowly now, feet scuffing over warm dust, past flickering oil lamps and the quiet clink of clay pots being washed. But where you're heading is older than shops, older than streets, and just as ancient as Babylon's love for shadows. You're going to see the clepsydra, the water clock. Yes, while sundials ruled the day, the Babylonians had another trick for telling time, especially after sunset, or on days when the sun decided to nap behind dust or clouds. Tucked into a small courtyard near the astronomer's quarter, this water clock isn't much to look at. Just a wide, shallow bowl with a small hole near the base. Suspended above it is a thin jar, dripping at a precise rate. Plink, plink, plink. And yet, this humble contraption has been telling time longer than many people have been alive. A scribe crouches nearby, recording intervals on a tablet as the water level drops. He has a stick marked with lines, which he lowers gently into the bowl to measure elapsed time. Each line corresponds to a portion of an hour, or at least, to a rhythm someone once decided felt like one. Historians still argue about how accurate these clepsydras really were. Some believe the Babylonians adjusted their flow rates seasonally, swapping out jars, or even heating the water slightly in winter to keep it from slowing down. Others think the clocks were ceremonial, used more for ritual pacing than precise hour counting. But tonight, this one is doing its job. You crouch beside it and listen. The sound is soft, hypnotic, like the city breathing in slow drips. Plink, plink, plink. The scribe glances at you and smiles faintly. "This is for timing prayers," he says. "Evening devotions must last 9 lines of water." You nod, unsure how long that is, but trusting the water to know. Unlike sundials, which demand sun and shadow, clepsydras are self-contained. They don't care about clouds or eclipse omens. They measure time as a quiet surrender, a slow giving up of one thing to make space for another. The past flowing gently into the present. Nearby, another bowl is set up, not for prayers but for cooking. A servant stirs a pot and glances every so often at her drip bowl, set on a carved brick. Each line means one stir. When the shadow disappears, the water clock steps in. You wonder how many of these clocks exist in Babylon. Probably more than anyone admits. Hidden in back rooms, whispering time in drips. Used to pace sermons, doctor visits, even baths. There's a story, dubious but delightful, that a healer once refused to examine a patient until 3 lines of water had passed, claiming the humors needed time to settle. Whether he was wise or just sleepy, no one knows. You close your eyes and focus on the sound. Plink, plink, plink. There's a calming democracy to it. No matter who you are, no matter what hour the stars declare, the water flows for everyone the same. You look up. Stars are beginning to pierce the dark. One by one, they glimmer into view. Not bold, but bashful. The night belongs to them now. And yet, the clepsydra keeps dripping. This is how Babylon bridged day and night, shadow by sun, flow by moon, and somewhere in between, a kind of peace that only comes when you stop chasing the moment and start watching it unfold. You dip your fingers into the bowl. The water is warm, kissed by the memory of the sun. You imagine each drop carrying away a tiny fraction of the day. The laughter in the marketplace, the priest's frown at the lion's paw, the parrot who once yelled at ink shadows. All of it now, drifting downstream in a bowl no bigger than a dinner plate. The scribe lowers his stick again. One more line, he says softly, almost to himself. And in that moment, you realize, here in Babylon, time isn't always loud. It doesn't always stride in with bells or gongs. Sometimes it trickles. Sometimes it leans. Sometimes it's measured not by stars, or priests, or courts, but by a bowl, and a stick, and someone watching with care. The hour passes, not with a tick, but with a drip. Night has arrived fully now, folding softly over the city like a velvet shawl. The stars are out in clusters, as though someone sprinkled salt across a vast, dark table, and you feel the hum of Babylon shift to something gentler, more inward. The merchants are gone, the children are inside. But above you, on the rooftops and high towers, a different kind of watcher is waking up. You're heading to the edge of the city, where the temple astronomers do their work. Not with telescopes, of course, but with sight lines, star maps, and questions that seem too big for one night to hold. The ziggurat looms above you again, massive and layered like a sleeping mountain. You climb, slowly, the steps worn from thousands of years of sandaled feet. Your breath slows. The night is warm but not heavy, and you can already hear the faint clink of styluses on clay as the star watchers begin their shift. You're here to see something special. How the night sky teaches Babylonians about the next day's shadows. Yes, they watch the stars to predict the sun. At the top, you find a platform strewn with scrolls, clay tablets, and what looks suspiciously like someone's leftover bread. An apprentice nods to you, then points upward. There, above the edge of the city, is a cluster of stars just peeking into view. The astronomers call these the Zikpu stars, rising stars. When one of them appears just before sunrise, it signals the start of a new time period, a new day, sometimes even a new month. Historians still puzzle over how Babylonians linked star risings with solar shadow lengths, but the evidence is there. Clay tablets with dual charts, mapping both stellar events and solar angles. It's as though they lived in a woven world where day and night constantly whispered to each other, sharing notes on where to shine and when to stretch. You sit beside an elder astronomer wrapped in a linen shawl. He's humming softly and scratching calculations into clay, diagonal lines, numbers in base 60, small wedge marks like footprints across sand. He speaks without looking at you. We watch the stars, so we know when the day will begin and how long it will last. He gestures toward a square slab nearby, another kind of sundial, but one that won't see light until morning. It's been aligned perfectly with known solar paths, adjusted every season to account for the tilt of the Earth. Not that they called it tilt. To them, the heavens turned, not the ground. But they noticed. Oh yes. They saw that certain stars always rose before longer days. That some disappeared during the shortest ones. And using those rhythms, they could guess when the sun would rise, how steep its arc would be, how fast its shadow would crawl across the courtyard below. It's said that some priests could predict, with eerie accuracy, not only sunrise, but the exact moment a temple's gnomon shadow would touch its noon mark. And how? By starlight. There's a poetic phrase etched into one tablet. The stars draw the lines the shadows will follow. You watch as the elder places a pebble on the slab in front of him. That, he says, is where the first light will fall. You believe him. There's a story passed between apprentices here, half myth, half memory, of a boy who could name all the Zikpu stars from a single glance. They say he could even smell dawn coming, though that part might have been due to his proximity to the temple bakery. Still, the connection stands. Stargazing in Babylon wasn't about dreams or wishes. It was about planning, scheduling, reading the future, not through prophecy, but through patterns. One fringe theory, still debated among scholars, suggests that nighttime star maps were sometimes overlaid with transparent sheets, drawn with expected shadow paths, like a celestial projector. Imagine a priest holding up a constellation chart, flipping it at dawn and saying, "Today, the shadow reaches third gate by mid-prayer." You stretch out on the warm stone, gazing up at the sky. It's impossibly wide. The stars don't twinkle. They shimmer, steady and slow. And between them, lines begin to form in your mind. Not constellations exactly, but possibilities. You see the sun before it rises. You feel the angles before they stretch. And you understand suddenly why the Babylonians believed the night held the shape of tomorrow. The elder speaks again. People think the sun tells the time, but it only casts the story. The stars, they write it. You rest your head back, listening to the scratch of stylus on clay, the occasional cough, the far-off hoot of an owl. No sundial needed here. No gnomon, no dripping bowl. Just a sky full of quiet instructions and a city that listens. The wind at this height has cooled, brushing lightly across your arms as if to remind you that the night has turned a corner. From the ziggurat's upper tier, you can see Babylon sprawling outward, lanterns flickering in the maze of streets, rooftops glowing softly under starlight, the river a winding ribbon of silver. You make your way back down, step by patient step, shadow now preceding you instead of trailing behind. It's strange. During the day, shadows follow. At night, they lead. You're heading toward one of the temple workyards now, where clay is molded, incense is prepared, and the city's quieter rituals unfold. These yards run on schedules too, and while they lack the dramatic precision of courtrooms or stargazing decks, They depend on shadows just the same. You arrive as a group of young workers finish sweeping the courtyard. They're laughing, half whispering, trying to be respectful of the temple's silence while also racing each other to put away brooms. A woman, older, with streaks of gray at her temples, claps her hands once. They stop. She nods toward a wall where a narrow beam of moonlight falls across a painted line. "End of shift," she says. And it is. Not because of a bell or a formal announcement, but because the shadow of the gate no longer reaches the edge of the offering table. That shadow, so reliable by day, still leaves traces at night. And here in the temple yard, people read even those faint hints. You sit by a kiln, its heat lingering in the bricks, and listen to the creak of baskets being stored, the rustle of straw mats, the last footsteps of the workers heading home. One of them pauses to look at a carved stone sunk into the courtyard floor. It's plain, worn nearly smooth, but if you squint, you can see faint grooves, the remnants of an old sundial long since retired. "Still here," he says, tapping it gently with his toe. "Even when it's not working, it remembers." Historians still debate whether these shadow markers had official functions or were simply placeholders, used casually, as you might glance at the sun through a window and guess it's time to leave. But in Babylon, even casual glances at time carried weight. There's a fringe tale about a temple cook who used her own shadow to time bread baking. She'd plant her feet in the same place each day and turn only when her silhouette reached the far corner of the fire pit. People swore she never burned a loaf in 50 years. The fire priest wanted to paint shadow lines on the kitchen floor. She refused. "Trust the body," she said. "It knows the sun." And it's not just workers or cooks. Even scribes, those champions of clay and ink, relied on shadows, especially when transcribing difficult or sacred texts. Light mattered. Too much and the wax would melt. Too little and the tablets would crack under pressure. One scribe once wrote a marginal note. "This line was written at shadowfall. May it be straight." You find that oddly touching. In another corner of the yard sits a bench with an overhanging fig tree. Its shadow, during the day, apparently acts as a timekeeper for the servants, when the shade touches the third bench slat. It's time to stir the incense pot. A small, quiet system, but consistent. And tonight, even without the sun, someone has lit a lamp near the tree, its flame flickering, casting its own dancing silhouette. Shadows made by fire, time by flicker. One boy crouches nearby, fascinated. He tries to line up his hand with the fig tree's lamp shadow. "Is it time now?" he whispers. The older woman chuckles. "Time for rest. That's the only kind of time that matters now." You smile. There's something deeply human about how these people stretch their own stories across the backdrop of moving light. No need for seconds, minutes, or countdown timers. Just motion, memory, practice. The stars above shift a little more westward. Someone sings a soft melody inside the kitchen. You lean back against the courtyard wall, warmed from within by kiln bricks and the faint, roasted smell of barley. You close your eyes and see it all again. The lion's paw, the barley dial, the stargazers with their pebbles, the cook watching her own shadow stretch past the bread oven. Babylon measures time like you measure comfort, in small shifts, soft signs, and the gentle belief that enough light will return tomorrow. You open your eyes. The courtyard is empty now. Only the flickering lamp remains, and the old sundial, resting. Not obsolete, just sleeping. You step softly out of the temple yard, where silence now blankets the stones like a shawl, and wander toward one of the residential quarters nearby. This is where the city's rhythms are quietest. Not priestly, not political, just deeply human. Shadows still matter here, maybe more than anywhere, because this is where they shape lives. You turn down a narrow lane lit by low, flickering lamps hung from hooks hammered into mud brick walls. Somewhere a dog yawns. Somewhere else a baby hiccups. And here, at the doorway of a modest two-story home, you see a woman crouching with a charcoal stick, tracing a line across the threshold stone. It's not graffiti, it's a calendar. She stands, wiping her hands, and gestures for you to look. There, carved faintly into the edge of the wall, are rows of short marks. At a certain hour every day, the shadow of her front gate post touches a different line, and she records what happened. Deliveries, arguments, rain, the day the fig tree finally bore fruit. This one, she says, pointing to a smudged mark, was when my son came home with a bruised knee and half a pomegranate. It's not timekeeping in the grand sense. It's timekeeping as journaling, as memory. Historians still argue about whether these household markings were widely practiced or just idiosyncratic. But findings of etched lines on domestic thresholds across Mesopotamian sites suggest the tradition had roots. Not everyone wrote tablets. Some people wrote in shadow. You walk through the quarter, seeing more examples as your eyes adjust. Charcoal notches on a laundry wall, sun-worn grooves beside cooking stoves, even a small sundial etched into the flat top of a rain barrel. At one house, you spot something you haven't seen before, a vertical sundial mounted on the inside of a window frame. The gnomon, a thin bronze pin, casts its shadow directly onto the wall, where soft paint markings show the family's mealtimes. Breakfast at first curve, someone once wrote. Wash clothes at long edge. Tea with cousin when tip reaches curtain. It's oddly poetic. A domestic ballet set to the choreography of light. You pass an old man rocking gently on a woven stool. He's peeling something, maybe garlic, and watching the shadow of his neighbor's balcony slide slowly toward him. I know when she's going to start singing, he murmurs. When that line hits my feet, it always begins. And sure enough, from somewhere above, a voice begins humming. In these homes, time isn't mechanical. It isn't even particularly linear. It's relational. It arrives when it's supposed to, announced not by bells or declarations, but by slanted light, by color, by habit. And it's respected, not feared. There's an old Babylonian proverb scrawled onto a tablet fragment. The house that eats without shadow will hunger again. No one's quite sure what it means. Some say it's about superstition. Never eat in full darkness. Others believe it refers to routine. Eat when the light tells you. Trust the sun and your stomach will follow. You turn a corner and see a family gathered for dinner in their courtyard. The table is low. The food simple: flatbread, lentils, olives, a bowl of sweet dates. They're lit not by flame, but by the last dusky fringe of twilight. One child glances toward the far wall, where the vine's shadow has reached the third painted circle. She smiles. "Dinner, Shadow," she says. No need to argue. No need to check a clepsydra. It's time. You're invited to sit. Someone hands you a fig. The family doesn't ask why you're here, because strangers passing through are common in Babylon, especially those who walk slowly, quietly, shadow by shadow. You chew slowly. The fig is soft, sweet, full of seeds. The child's laughter fills the air. An older sibling starts clearing plates right on cue, as the courtyard's long-standing routine demands. There's even a chalk mark above the door that says, "Sleep begins when shadow passes lintel." You look. It's nearly there. You smile to yourself. These aren't rituals, not exactly. They're rhythms. Personal, gentle, passed down not in books but in timing. Even rest in Babylon has a schedule written in light. You lean back against the wall, stars overhead, cool stone beneath, one last bite of fig. And the shadow? It's almost across the threshold. You slip away from the family courtyard with a gentle wave, stepping quietly into the lane as the final thread of light vanishes over the rooftops. The lamps are brighter now, more of them lit, flames gently bowing in the breeze, casting their own shadows that dance and wobble against plaster and brick. But you're walking toward something even more intimate now, toward stories, toward memory, toward the soft, crinkled pages of Babylon's past that don't live on tablets or temple walls. You're going to hear about the crooked sundial. Not a myth, not quite a scandal, just a small, slow-burning moment in the city's bureaucratic history that still gets chuckles in the right tea circles. It begins, like many minor Babylonian crises, in a palace garden. You arrive at the old garden gate, its archway sagging slightly, the ivy too ambitious for its trellis. Inside is quiet now, long after the royal gardeners have left, after the birds have stilled, and the air smells only of warm soil and memory. In the garden's center stands a stone dial. It's elegant, precise, or rather, it was. Historians confirm that this sundial was once considered a model of timekeeping artistry, commissioned by a rather perfectionist king whose name shows up in more memos than battles. He wanted a sundial that would not only tell the hour, but align precisely with seasonal solar declinations, point true north, and impress visitors from Nineveh with how civilized Babylon's afternoons were. And so the best artisans were summoned. Bronze was melted. Shadows were modeled with wax figurines and sun-baked figs. A dozen apprentices reportedly fainted from heat during the alignment ceremony. And at last, it was done. One problem. It was wrong, not dramatically, not insultingly, just enough. Enough for shadows to fall 15 minutes off. Enough for visiting envoys to chuckle politely while squinting at the lines. Enough that the scribes had to quietly adjust court timetables to accommodate sundial variation as though it were a particularly sensitive official. And worst of all, enough for the king's tea time to arrive too late, when the bread was cold and the honey had already been borrowed by ants. The cause? A misalignment of the gnomon, just a few degrees. No one confessed. A sculptor blamed a slope in the foundation. A mathematician blamed the bronze. One disgruntled assistant suggested that the sun itself was being inconsistent and was told to go organize the spice racks until further notice. You sit beside the sundial now, still angled slightly too far west. Its lines are elegantly carved, but the shadow is always just off. And the best part? They never moved it. Why? Because bureaucracy had already caught up. New records, new schedules, festival start times adjusted. The crooked sundial became the standard. As one palace clerk scribbled in a rare moment of sass, "Let the shadow fall where it will follow." There's a gentle comfort in that, isn't there? That even in a city obsessed with the math of time, people allowed for error. They built it into the routine. The sundial was wrong, but predictably wrong, and that made it useful. You lie back on the garden bench, feeling the night lean in. This story passed from scribe to scribe, each adding their own flair. Some say the sundial was deliberately misaligned by a jealous architect. Others claim it was the king's favorite joke, a reminder that no one, not even the sun, got to interrupt his breakfast. One fringe account says that the crooked dial was secretly recalibrated using moonlight and water reflections. Another says that eventually, the royal cats used it as a sun-warming spot, and that became its true function. But however the tale grew, one thing never changed. The sundial remained. And so, in the shadows of royal intentions and gentle mistakes, Babylon learned a valuable lesson. That time, even when imperfect, can still carry you forward. That systems bend. That people adapt. That a shadow 15 minutes off still tells you when it's time for tea, if you let it. The garden is silent now. The wind stirs faintly through papyrus reeds. Somewhere nearby, a breeze nudges a hanging bell, and the sound rings out. Not sharp, not insistent, just present. The stars overhead are clearer now, and for a moment, you imagine one of them smiling, remembering the day the court schedule was delayed because the shadow wouldn't behave. You reach out, trace your finger along one of the dial's lines, worn, weathered, beloved. Still wrong. Still here. Still telling time. Night deepens like a warm bath. Not sudden, but surrounding. And the city of Babylon wraps itself in it without resistance. You've wandered back into the inner quarters, closer now to the beating heart of the temple district. But there's no chanting, no grand ceremonies tonight. Just a hush, filled with the gentle clatter of clay, the rustle of reed paper, and the low murmur of people who've been reading the stars too long to raise their voices. You're going to visit the scholars. The ones who didn't just read the sundials, they argued with them. You enter through an arched doorway into what once served as a school for scribes. It's quiet now, more archive than classroom, but the walls are still lined with rows of clay tablets. They glow faintly in lamplight, the wedges and lines pressed by fingers long since dust. Some of them record royal decrees. Others, just charts, columns, marks on shadow lengths, angles of descent, the curve of time from solstice to equinox and back again. In one corner, An old man with ink-stained fingertips is gently brushing clay dust off a shelf of records. You greet him, and he waves a hand as if to say, "Of course you came." Time always circles back. You settle beside him as he unrolls a fragment of a wax tablet, pointing to the marks along its curved edge. "Shadow mathematics," he says with a smirk, "for when the sun refuses to cooperate." He's referring to the Babylonians' attempts to calculate shadow paths, not just watch them, to predict, estimate, even model them using geometry and a base 60 number system that made them the envy of every future math nerd. Historians agree, their math was extraordinary. They could measure angles using degrees, divide the day into intervals, and calculate when certain celestial alignments would throw unusual shadows. One of the records even details a correction factor for when sundials were placed on hills versus valleys. The entry ends with a note that translates more or less as, "This will probably still be wrong." You chuckle. A fringe theory posits that Babylonian mathematicians competed to see who could build the most complicated shadow equation. One tablet, found in a trash pit of course, contains a formula involving the height of the gnomon, the curvature of the Earth, which they did not officially know about, and the average length of a goat. Scholars suspect it was a joke, but the seriousness behind it remains. These weren't just stargazers and scribes, they were modelers of behavior. And time, shadowed, seasonal, solar time, was one of the greatest mysteries to model. The elder shows you a clay fragment shaped like a triangle. "This was part of a teaching sundial," he says. "Each student got a piece. They had to make it tell the hour without moving." You look closer. It's uneven, asymmetrical, but you can see faint scratches where someone tried to etch hour lines. One line has been angrily crossed out. Maybe someone had a bad exam day. You ask him if the sundials were ever right. He laughs, deep and warm. "Not often. But when they were, it felt like the sun agreed with you." You nod. That makes sense. The scholars weren't just interested in telling time. They were obsessed with explaining it. Why the same gnomon cast a shorter shadow in summer than winter. Why the length of twilight changed depending on where you stood. Why some days just felt longer. They didn't always have the answers, but they made the questions beautiful. One tablet describes a wandering hour, a unit of time that moved depending on the behavior of light. It was part science, part poetry, and part weather forecast. The author wrote, "When the wandering hour lingers, expect wind from the west and poor market prices." You leave the archive room and step into the small courtyard outside, where the scholars once took breaks, told jokes, maybe even played guessing games with the shadows. The moon is high now, casting its own silver geometry over the stones. Not sharp, not strong, but present. Someone has drawn a sundial on the floor with chalk. It's clearly recent. It wouldn't work at night, of course, but that's not the point. You walk around it, tracing the numbers with your foot, remembering how many minds tried to chase the sun using only a stick, some math, and a very patient attitude. The elder joins you, holding a lamp. He sets it at the dial's edge, and suddenly the lines jump to life. Shadows stretch across the chalk, forming angles where none had existed a moment ago. He smiles. "Sometimes we borrow the sun's ideas." You sit quietly together, watching the lamp flame flicker. The dial glows in soft orange and blue shadows, a sundial at midnight. Wrong by every measure, but deeply, deeply right. You realize then, Babylon didn't just observe time, it translated it. Through tablets and tools, shadows and stars, lamplight and laughter. And though the sun is long gone from the sky, its memory plays here still, in angles, in calculations, in the whispered patience of people who spent entire lives measuring how long it took for light to say goodbye. The air is cooler now, but not cold, just enough to draw a shawl over your shoulders if you had one. The stars wheel slowly above you, unhurried, ancient, and familiar, and you're walking along the quietest paths now, those used by caretakers, stargazers, and dreamers who have no meetings in the morning. You're headed toward the city's edge again, not the walls, but the gardens. The hanging gardens? Not quite. Those are the stuff of legend, embroidered by travelers and polished by time. No, this garden is something simpler. A domestic oasis, a place where greenery meets architecture in subtle, peaceful ways. And nestled inside it, tucked between fig trees and carved stone fountains, is something surprisingly humble. A sundial that doesn't work anymore, or rather, it works wrong on purpose. You step beneath the pergola and find it, a low platform with a small gnomon rising from its center. But instead of 12-hour marks, there are only 3, spaced evenly apart, each labeled with a symbol, a crescent moon, a cluster of grapes, and a bird in flight. A woman in her middle years, the caretaker of this garden, sees you approach. She gestures gently to sit beside her on the carved bench. "This is not for time," she says, her voice low and gentle. "This is for feeling." She explains. Each symbol represents a different moment in the day, not in minutes or fractions, but in moods. When the shadow touches the moon, it's time to reflect. When it lands on the grapes, it's time to eat or rest. And when it reaches the bird, you must stand, stretch, move like the bird, even if just a little. This isn't official Babylonian timekeeping, not temple approved, not tax scheduled. But here, in this garden, it has become its own language, a private rhythm. Historians often overlook these personal spiritual sundials. Most fragments we find are standardized, 12 marks, clear hour lines, priestly notations. But occasionally, among household ruins, archaeologists uncover oddities, stone circles with no math, gnomons with decorative tops, even hour lines shaped like vines or waves. And we wonder, were these for time or for mood? You and the caretaker sit in silence as the wind stirs through the leaves. A soft rustle, the clink of water in a nearby basin. The moonlight shines just enough that you can see the gnomon's shadow, faint but present, leaning toward the symbol of the grapes. She smiles. "That means tea." She stands, disappears briefly behind a reed curtain, and returns with 2 small cups. Clay, simple, chipped. The tea is warm and smells of cardamom and chamomile. You sip slowly. The shadow does not move much, but neither do you. She tells you stories of her mother, who marked her own courtyard wall with time phrases instead of numbers. "Now the soup," one said. Now the story. Now listen to the wind. She painted them fresh every spring. Over the years, those lines became a kind of sundial of family memory. One story stands out. A boy who carved a sundial into a clay toy, not because he understood it, but because he thought it would make the toy more serious. Every time the shadow landed on a certain notch, he'd declare a new law for his pet chicken. He took himself very seriously, she says, eyes twinkling. You sip again. She continues. There are clocks for kings, for courts, for scribes, but gardens need something softer. This dial, she says, is for people who no longer chase time, who walk when the shadow leans, who sit when it hesitates, who watch it simply because it's beautiful. And it is. It arcs gently now, barely clinging to the stone, its shape more whisper than wedge. You reach out and touch the edge of it with your fingertip. It's cool, solid, alive with the idea of motion, even in stillness. There's a saying etched in the base of the dial, in cuneiform so weathered it takes a moment to decipher. But she helps you. The shadow is not the hour, it is the invitation. You sit with that, and it makes sense here, among the figs and vines and slowly cooling tea. Not all time must be measured. Some can simply be felt, not demanded, not defined, just gently noticed. She gathers the empty cups. You nod in thanks. She doesn't ask your name. You don't ask hers. There is only shadow, and the scent of herbs, and a kind of understanding that belongs only to people who sit with dials long after the sun is gone. As you leave, you glance back. The gnomon stands patiently. The bird in flight waits. Maybe, tomorrow, it will be time to stretch your wings. The walk back into the heart of the city is almost dreamlike. You've passed through light, shadow, silence, and tea, and now you're drifting between buildings lit only by moonlight and the occasional whisper of oil lamp glow from a second-story window. But your destination tonight isn't a temple or a garden or even a home. It's a little structure tucked beside the outer wall of the great ziggurat. Easy to miss, unless you know what to look for. And what you're looking for is the hour that doesn't exist. You slip inside through an open stone arch, greeted by cool air and the scent of dried papyrus. The chamber is small, spare. Its only furniture, a large circular stone dial carved flat into the floor. At first glance, it looks like a sundial, but it's not. There's no gnomon, no peg, no raised stick to cast a shadow. Instead, the lines are carved in uneven intervals, their spacing irregular. One section, between the 10th and 11th marks, is completely blank. This is the record of the disappearing hour. You sit on the bench in the corner, and a scribe, old as twilight and quiet as dust, enters. He doesn't speak. He just places a small lamp at the center of the dial and lets it burn. The flickering flame reveals the ancient lines, the ones that curve too much, or not enough, or not at all. Then he finally says, "This was our best attempt." And you understand. This dial represents an ancient Babylonian effort to reconcile the uncooperative truth of time, that sometimes hours vanish. You see, the Babylonians divided the daylight into 12 parts, 12 hours, no matter what season it was. But of course, in winter, daylight is short, so the hours had to shrink, or disappear. This chamber is where they tried to account for that. Historians still debate how precisely they handled it. Did they just let some hours be shorter? Did they rename or reassign them? Did they just erase one? The absence on this dial suggests that, at least for a time, they accepted the imperfection. There's something poignant about it. A whole hour acknowledged as missing, not forgotten, not skipped, but left blank. Like a pause in music, like a breath between thoughts. You imagine a priest standing here on a cold winter morning, squinting at a pale sun, waiting for a shadow that won't land on that gap, and accepting it. Because the sun doesn't care about your calendar. There's a quiet fringe theory among Babylonian scholars that this missing hour was symbolic. Not a glitch, but a gift. A moment meant for stillness, for letting go of time altogether. The scholar sitting beside you nods slightly, as if he knows exactly what you're thinking. He lights another lamp and places it beside the blank space on the dial. The flickering shadows around it are shapeless, inconsistent. They won't stay where they're meant to. Not everything needs a measure, he murmurs. You nod. You trace your hand along the gap, feeling its smoothness, the way it resists labels. And you think about the city beyond these walls, people checking dial marks, measuring barley by shadows, starting court proceedings at the lion's paw. And then this space, where 1 hour gets no name, no shadow, only acknowledgement. You remember now, the parrot trained to call out shadow times, the fig vendor who swore by the 8th stone, the crooked sundial in the palace garden, the stargazer with a pebble on a slab, the mother who painted now the story on her courtyard wall, and all of it somehow flows toward this blank hour. It's not lost. It's held. The scholar stands now, lifts the lamp again, and blows it out. The room fades into dark. The blank space on the dial fades with it. And you sit, very still, in the middle of a city that built its identity on shadows, and yet made room, just a little, for what cannot be cast, or caught, or counted. You step back into the open air, and Babylon is nearly asleep. The streets are hushed, as if the city has pulled a blanket over itself. Only a few figures move now, guardians of gates, temple watchers, maybe a grandmother guiding a child inside by the wrist with one final whispered, "Enough moonlight for tonight." You follow the sound of crickets toward the great steps of the ziggurat once more, but you don't climb it. Not this time. Instead, you circle to its far side, where the stones are cold and smooth, and the sky overhead opens like a great dome of ink. You lie back. There is nothing above you now but stars, bright, quiet, thousands of them. You think of them as the city's first clocks, each one marking time not with movement you can see, but movement you can trust. Slowly, invisibly, each wheel turning within another wheel, and somehow it all works. The priests will know which stars rise when. The scribes will count how many fingers of light remain before dawn. The shadows will return. And still, for this moment, there are none. There's a peace in that, a blankness. The missing hour, expanded into a missing night. You rest your hands behind your head, staring up, and you let the memories of the day roll over you. Not in order, not as lessons, but as scenes, lit and edged by shadow. The priest marking incense time by a lion's paw. The baker's shadow stretched across the third notch of his worn courtyard. The crooked dial in the palace garden, stubborn and beloved. The mother tracking her son's bruised pomegranate by the movement of sunlight over a doorframe. The scholars scratching base 60 equations into clay just to understand why the day felt shorter than the last. The boy with his toy and his chicken laws. The garden dial with no numbers, only grapes, birds, and moments. You've walked through the whole city, not chasing time, but tracing its path. Not fearing it, not fighting it, but watching it. Letting it stretch and shorten, bend and blur, whisper and glow. The wind moves past your cheek like a sigh. You imagine the sun just below the edge of the world, waiting to return, stretching a finger forward so it knows where to shine when morning comes. And you realize something. The Babylonians didn't invent time. They didn't even try to control it. They just noticed it, lovingly, patiently, repeatedly. They let it walk with them, across bricks and barley, past gnomons and gods, through arguments and laughter and fig stains, and they watched where it landed. And when it didn't land at all, when it vanished for a moment, they left a space for that too. You lie still, your eyes flutter. Above you, the stars do not tick. The city does not rush. Everything is where it should be. And your shadow, if it could be seen, would be stretched soft across the stones. And now, here you are. The stars above Babylon remain, quiet, patient, distant, but somehow closer than they were 2 hours ago. The city has fallen entirely still. No laughter now, no voices, no scraping clay or creaking carts. Just the gentle hush of night, the memory of stone beneath your back, and the slow, unmeasured breath of sleep drawing nearer. You've walked the city not as a traveler, but as a watcher. You've listened to the silence between timekeepers, to the tickless pause between the gnomon's shadow and the water's next drop. You've seen how a city can measure without rushing, how a whole civilization once believed that a shadow moving across a wall was enough to guide everything from taxes to bedtime stories. Let that slowness wrap around you now. There's no more need to watch the sun or wait for the next hour mark. The final line has already passed. The fig tree shadow has crossed the doorway. The temple lamp has gone out. There's just you, breathing. Just the stillness, humming. Just a night deep enough to hold all the missing hours. You're allowed to rest now, to drift, to forget where one thought ends and another begins. Let the shadows stretch. Let the light return in its own time. You are exactly where you're meant to be. Quiet now. Sleep well. End of script. Sweet dreams.